Roosevelt, I had a quote from one of his books. That's right, he was a president who wrote several books before he became president.
Mm-hmm.
The philosopher king, isn't that such a kind of ideal to aspire to?
It's what you want in a president, a studious,
Right.
writerly man. Or woman. Back then it was just a man. Women couldn't vote.
So this is from the preface to one of his books called The Wilderness Hunter. Most of them were about hunting, or there were a couple about history or just like nature books. So it was a very broad spectrum of expertise, and he also read very broadly, which I think is just, that in itself is kind of a lesson, because we've been talking about Renaissance men a little bit on this podcast. Seems mildly like a modern Renaissance man. So the quote says, "From its very nature, the life of the hunter is in most places evanescent, and when it has vanished, there can be no real substitute in old settled countries." And I thought this would be a good quote to lead into our discussion of his environmentalism or his conservationist policies, most famously the national parks.
Mm-hmm.
But what struck me the most is how he approached this topic from such a different perspective than do most present-day environmentalists, which I think we'd associate more with being vegan and hippie and just having this empathy for nature and feeling connected and all this kind of thing. His was a slightly more nuanced, maybe, view on things.
Yeah, we both studied environmentalism in university in different capacities, and this was always a big topic of conversation among the classes, talking about hunting versus veganism.
It's true.
Because as someone who isn't vegetarian, it's like I eat animal products, but then you see people hunting, you see pictures of dead animals, and you get very moved by them. And I think people who have always hunted, they understand the cycle of life and like the cycle of like what humans eat better than those of us who still choose to eat animal products but have never really connected with them.
Yeah, it's a good point. It reminds me a little bit, because we grew up in Nova Scotia where there's a big hunting culture, and there's also a fairly, especially in the rural areas, conservative culture.
Mm-hmm.
And the latter often meant that you were talking to people who were against so-called environmentalist policies and renewable energy and politics that focused on that kind of sustainability. But when you actually spoke to them about the local areas, for instance, they had an intuition for when deer populations were getting too high and how to keep these in balance. And it reminds me of how, let's say, park rangers will talk about forest fires very differently from people who live in cities and never actually go to the wilderness, who kind of view it like it's a murder scene or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think we also, as people who are striving to fight climate change, basically, we need to have open minds into the fact that people will always have different perspectives, and just because someone enjoys hunting doesn't mean that they're like a cruel killer who hates the planet.
Yeah.
It often means the opposite, especially with Roosevelt. This is how he got interested in environmentalism. I like this anecdotal story about his childhood. He was 9 and he went to like a fish market or whatever, and there was a seal there for sale. And you'd think a lot of kids, they'd see a dead seal and they'd be like, oh my goodness, I need to save the megafauna. But he was like, whoa, this is so cool. I need to save the megafauna. Let me buy the head of the seal and taxidermy it and start my own museum. He didn't have an official museum, but him and his siblings were starting collecting bugs and capturing small creatures in the woods and taxidermying them just in their home. I'm hoping our kids don't do that. That'd be kind of creepy. I'd be a little concerned, but he, through this way of valuing them in like a different way, but still in like an innately, not that their value is like for selling, like he wasn't trying to sell these things he taxidermied. He's like, they just are innately valuable.
I guess that's the takeaway, that environmentalism can wear many different faces. There was another anecdote about he was hunting and there was a bear that was tied up or injured or something, and the people who he was with were being kind of gleeful at it and were kind of fighting over who got to shoot it. But he basically considered it kind of a dishonorable hunting, and that the only reason they should shoot it was to kind of put it out of its misery. There's a lot of mythology about various presidents like that. For instance, from that story is where we get the teddy bear. how phenomenal is that? And that's another bucket list item of mine. To have a small, soft thing named after me.
The Aaron Armadillo.
Something like that.
Yeah.
The other thing from that quote that I read that I think is so relevant to designing a utopia is the second half of it. He says, when it has vanished, it being the life of the hunter, as he said, there can be no real substitutes in old settled countries. So this is kind of speaking to what is lost when we perhaps industrialize and over domesticize, maybe. And it's almost like a eulogy. Last week we talked about Ernest Hemingway and the way that increasing bureaucracy has taken away a lot of the romance and possibilities of travel in life. And I think this is similarly talking about how infrastructure and maybe urbanization takes away a lot of the wilderness in all its meanings.
Yeah, and as we remove the people who are intimately connected with nature, be it the hunters or people who are in rural places as people move to urban communities, we lose the understanding, like the personal understanding of nature, because we as city dwellers can be like, well, there's still deer, there's still bears, but people who are intimately connected with it can see how the whole food chain is slowly being depleted.
Yeah.
And they can catch it way sooner than we can.
Yeah, that was another point about his policy, is that I think he's a great case study for how one's environmentalism is born out of one's personal experience, because he spent decades basically as a rancher and hunter, and therefore personally surrounded by wilderness, whereas you can have environmentalists in cities, many of them exist, but their appreciation for nature is much more theoretical. Like, let's say, for instance, people who are learned regarding climate change and biodiversity loss and land use and waste and things like this. They know how ecosystems are disrupted, and they might know the specifics of greenhouse gases and kind of various chemical cycles in nature. But it's, more theoretical rather than being a kind of individual, personal connection. And also, the less accessible we make wilderness, the less of those people we have. So it's kind of a domino effect a little bit.